Well, good morning, Grace Church. It's great to be with you again and to be seen by you. I'm sorry I can't see you, but it's a real pleasure to be a part of this series with Harry as he launched last week the introduction to the fruit of the Spirit. Today we come to the topic of joy. And I want to ask you, what's the greatest day of your life? What is the best 24-hour unit of time you've experienced since you've been on the planet? What would you say? How would you respond? I mean, there have been some extraordinary, joy filled days in your life. There was the day that you were born, the day when the clock of your life started ticking and you sucked in your first lungful of breath, and the whole adventure, the whole miracle of your existence began. That was an amazing day. There was the day that you took your first step. You went from being immobile to mobile. You were a walker, and your world was never the same, and your mother's world was never the same. There was a day you spoke your first word, and from that day on, you were a talker. Some of you started talking on that day, and you haven't come up for air ever since. That was an amazing day. And then there was the day when you got your first job. Do you remember that? First time you got a paycheck, and your name was on it. That was a joy-filled, amazing day. There was a day maybe when you went on your first date. You know, when Jean and I started dating, we fought to have firm boundaries on our physical relationship. And we wanted to be committed to dealing with our sexuality in a God-honoring way. And I knew what would be the greatest day of my life. I used to pray that Jesus wouldn't come back before my wedding night, because I knew that would be a great day. There was the day maybe your child was born, the day you met God and experienced forgiveness. These are all incredibly joy-filled days, but I believe that there's another candidate, and that this day, today, can be a day filled with joy. If you look at the calendar, it'd be this little square on the calendar today, right now. Not because today is going to be pleasant or easy or pain-free, because maybe it won't be. You know, when you think about it, this day is the only day that you've got. Every other day that's gone before it is irretrievably gone. It will never come back. There are people who spend their whole lives, regretting something that happened on one of those days, or wishing that those days could maybe come back again. And of course, they're all the days that will follow, but they're off in the future someplace. And there are people who sometimes spend their whole lives waiting for what they think might happen on one of those days, or worrying about something that they're afraid is going to happen on one of those days. And if you live that way, looking back and regretting, or looking ahead and waiting and worrying, it will steal your joy. This day right here is God's gift to you. This is the day that counts right here. That's why the psalmist wrote these words, "This is the day that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it." It doesn't say yesterday was the day that the Lord has made. That was a good day, wasn't it? It doesn't say tomorrow is the day the Lord will make and we'll be glad and rejoice when tomorrow gets here. It's this day, today. Joy is at the heart of God's plan for your life. You know, a striking thing to me is as we study the fruit of the Spirit, that if you were to ask me to predict what fruit Paul would list, love would be a no-brainer for being number one, first on the list. We all know that that's at the heart of what God's wants to be seen in our life, wants evident in our lives. Love God with all your heart and love other people. But what strikes me is that joy is number two on the list. The fruit of the Spirit is something that grows in me as I abide in God, because that's the kind of person God is. Let me say that again. The fruit of the Spirit is something that grows in me as I abide in God, because that's the kind of person God is. When you read the fruit of the Spirit, you're reading a description of the Spirit of God and the character of Jesus. If you get nothing else out of this message today, I'd like you to get this. Joy is at the heart of who God is. He has an infinite capacity for joy. And as you and I abide in him, that fruit manifests itself in our lives. You know, we should be clear about a couple things. Joy is very different from happiness. We sometimes think that as Christians, we're supposed to walk around with a big grin and a smile and should appear to be happy and smiling all the time. But if we did, that would be an artificial thing. Joy is not something that we have because we have a particular kind of personality or emotional makeup. You know, if you're a cheerful person, that just happens to be part of your personality. That is in no way distinctively Christian. We all know that to be a Christian doesn't mean we live a happy, troubled-free life. We know both from the Bible and from our own experience that that isn't true. Joy in the Bible is something that's very different from happiness, because happiness is a response to circumstances. If pleasant things happen, then we're happy. If unpleasant things happen, then we're unhappy. Somebody can act in such a way that wrecks your happiness. But when speaking about joy, Jesus says these words, "Your joy no one can take from you." John 16:22. In fact, Christian joy often exists in the context of pain in the Bible. So if joy doesn't come from circumstances, if joy doesn't come from our personality, where do we find and how do we experience true, lasting joy? The author, the origin, the source of true joy is God himself. The psalmist wrote these words, "In your presence is fullness of joy, and at your right hand there are pleasures forevermore." The origin of joy doesn't come from circumstances, it comes from God. Psalm 92 says, the psalmist writes, "You, God, have made me glad." You know, Jesus pictures God himself this way. When you think of reading through chapter 15, Luke 15, Jesus tells 3 stories, all picturing God as celebrating. He celebrates when certain things happen. When something's lost, was lost, has been found, there's a celebration. Jesus says in heaven, there is joy when people who are lost repent and come back to God. God is described as the ultimate possessor and source of joy. You know, it's kind of an exercise or a contrast. I want to ask you to imagine for a few moments what the opening sentences of the Bible might have been like if God was not a supremely joyful being. What might Genesis look like if God approached his work the way human beings often approach ours? So this is kind of an exercise in contrast, so journey with me for a moment here. In the beginning, it was 9 o'clock, so God had to go to work. He filled out a requisition to separate light from darkness. He considered making stars to beautify the night and planets to fill the skies, but thought it sounded like too much work, and besides, thought God, that's not my job. So he decided to knock it off early and call it a day, and he looked at all he had done, and he said, that'll have to do. On the second day, God separated the waters from the dry land, and he made all the dry land as a flat plain and functional. So behold, the whole earth looked something like Saskatchewan. He thought about making mountains and valleys and glaciers and jungles and forests, but he decided it wouldn't be worth the effort. And God looked at what he had done that day, and God said, it'll have to do. And God made a pigeon to fly in the air, and a carp to swim in the waters, and a cat to creep up on the dry ground. And actually, you know what? I just got to stop here for a sec here. I'm outside here. Here's our cat. Anyways, God made a pigeon to fly in the air and a carp to swim the waters and a cat to creep up on dry ground. And God thought about making millions of other species, all sizes and shapes and colors, but he couldn't drum up any enthusiasm for any other animals. In fact, he wasn't too crazy about the cat. So God looked at all he had done and God said, it'll have to do. And at the end of the week, God was seriously burnt out and exhausted and tired, and he breathed a big sigh of relief and he said, oh, thank me, it's Friday. You had to think about that one for a minute, didn't you? No, Genesis looks nothing like that. Instead, it's a song and it throbs with this refrain. And God spoke and it was so, and God saw and it was good. And on the first day, on the very first day, God said, let there be light. And there was light, and God saw that the light was good. And the first day, God's heart was full of joy. And he does this day after day. Each day he does it, and he says, and that's good. Oh, that's good. Little side note for a moment. We suffer from a disease which could be called taking it for granted. You ever take something for granted? Every day, the sun comes up, and we just take it for granted. And it can be 30 degrees every day. And if it's 28 or 32, we complain a little bit. Every moment, your heart beats, and we take it for granted. We just say, well, that's what a heart's supposed to do. It beats. And every moment, your lungs fill up with air, and grass grows, flowers bloom, birds sing, fish swim, and seasons change, and children grow, and cuts heal. And we say, yeah, been there, done that. Now wow me with something else. Get a promotion, or let me get a new house or a new car. I thought about this last night, and this blew my mind. Do you realize God has never taken anything for granted? God has seen everything there is to see. He knows all there is to know. And every day when the sun comes up, he is full of joy. We will not understand God until we understand this about him. Dallas Willard writes these words: God is the happiest being in the universe. Now, God also knows sorrow. Jesus was remembered, as we know, among other things, as a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Dallas Willard goes on to write these words: but the sorrow of God, like the anger of God, is this temporary response to a fallen world. And it will be banished forever from his heart on that day, which will come, when the world is set right. For joy is God's basic character. Joy is God's eternal destiny. God is the happiest being in the universe. And here's why this matters. Jesus says these words. He says, I have said these things. I taught you. I've been with you. I've modeled for you. I've shown you what life can be about. And I've done it all for a reason. I've got a mission. Jesus says, I have said these things to you. Why? So that my joy might be in you, and your joy might be filled up to the top. That makes a statement about the kind of person Jesus was. You don't say that kind of thing to people who know you best if they think of you as a somber, unsmiling, kind of crusty person. Anybody here ever read or seen Winnie the Pooh? There's one character in that story who's always complaining, never happy, and that would be Eeyore. If you're Eeyore, you don't say, I've said these things to you so that my joy might be in you. Jesus was well known as being a joyful man. That's part of why people loved to be around him. And his goal is for you and me to abide with him and be filled with authentic, God-honoring, genuine, pain-defying joy. Think for a moment to yourself, for those of you who are parents. We want our kids to be filled with joy, not in a selfish way, not in a superficial way. I want them to be serving, I want them to be good and focused on loving others, but I want them to be full of joy. God wants you to be full of joy. Are you? Lou Smees writes, to miss out on joy is to miss out on the reason for your existence. C.S. Lewis put it like this. He wrote, joy is the serious business of heaven. The Westminster Shorter Catechism says this, the chief end of human beings is to glorify God and what? And to enjoy him forever. Why? Because God is the happiest being in the universe. The Apostle Paul put it like this, rejoice in the Lord always. God is the ultimate possessor and source of joy. That's the reason why our joy as Christians can never be shaken by events, and it survives under the most difficult situations and circumstances and conditions. The reason for that is God is unchanging, and God is faithful, and God will never leave you. And if I fix my joy in anything else other than him, I discover it is transient and shifting, and so it fades. But if my joy is in God, through abiding in him, then because he is unchanging, and because he is faithful, Jesus says to you and to me, no one can take your joy away from you. Oh, isn't that good? Wow. I love that. It's no wonder the psalmist writes these words, whom have I in heaven but you? And earth has nothing, absolutely nothing I desire besides you. And so the joy of the Lord, his joy, becomes our strength. Nehemiah 8 verse 10 says, the joy, God's joy, becomes your strength, my strength, our strength. You know, one of my favorite verses that sums up so much of what the Bible teaches about joy comes from Habakkuk, and it's these words. Though the fig tree does not bud, he's just describing catastrophe after catastrophe. Though the fig tree does not bud, and there are no grapes on the vines, though the earth end, yet I will rejoice in God. What is it that produces that in our lives? It's the character of a person whose greatest business in life is to come to know God more deeply. And as they do, as our soul and our hearts are enlarged and expanded by the goodness and the greatness of God, we rejoice in him, and other things become just more peripheral because God is our portion, the greatest desire of our hearts and our souls. That's why Paul says in 2 Corinthians, when he's writing to the Corinthians about various tensions that exist in their lives, he writes these words, we are sorrowful, but always rejoicing. That's why you see this whole idea of affecting some kind of silly grin or artificial smile in life is the absolute reverse of what true joy is for a Christian. Joy can be a reality, even through tears. Joy remains when every circumstance for happiness goes. When God is the sweetest portion of our heart and our life, we discover that He never changes. His wisdom never fails. His promises are never forsaken. His sovereign power is always the same. It's the anchor that enables us to say, though sorrowful, we are always rejoicing. As I'm sure you have seen in the lives of many people who have gone through the dark days and difficulty and pain and even discouragement, I've seen this gift from God, the reality of a joy in God that nothing can take away. Joy is at the heart of God's plan for your life. The fruit of the Spirit, joy, is something that grows in us as we abide in God, because that's the kind of person God is. May you be full of His joy this day. God bless, friends.